Good day. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to this critical engagement webinar series in which we discuss, debate, and evaluate the ever-changing body of knowledge emerging as a consequence of the current COVID-19 pandemic. This series probes pandemic innovations, responses, and partnerships. My name is Sinethemba Makanya, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. I'm a doctoral candidate in medical humanities here at Wits. I'm completing my PhD on the interface between traditional healers and their practices and the philosophical knowledge around mental healing and the professional approaches of clinical psychologists. I'm a trained drama therapist with a psychology background. I'm also a traditional healer. I am hosting today with the Wits team in the Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care with Health System Sciences and the Adler Museum of Medicine. This week's series is inspired by the image, characteristics, and survival story of the Cape pangolin, whose close relatives are found across the globe. And this webinar seeks to unpack the interconnectedness of health, humanities, environment, and science through a lens of systems thinking. In today's live discussion, titled Pandemic, Lessons from History, we draw on the perspective of historians, Professor Howard Phillips and Dr. Glen Ncube. Professor Howard Phillips, Emeritus Professor of History in the University of Cape Town, is a world authority on pandemics and history. Having gained a PhD about the history of the Spanish flu epidemic in South Africa, he began to develop the field of social history of medicine. Among the many books he has written, co-written, and edited are, and I won't do justice to all of the books, Black October, The Impact of the Spanish Flu Epidemic of 1918, The Cape Doctor in the 19th Century, A Social History, Plague, Pox, and Pandemics, A Pocket History of Epidemics in South Africa. More recently, In the Time of Plague, Memories of the Spanish Flu Epidemic of 1918 in South Africa. Also joining us is Dr. Glen Ncube, based at the Department of Historical and Heritage Studies at the University of Pretoria. In his PhD, Dr. Ncube specializes in the histories of medicine, healthcare, with specific focus on Zimbabwe, tracing changes in healthcare policy and medical practice in colonial societies characterized by struggles over power, culture, and resources. His doctoral thesis was titled, The Making of Rural Healthcare in Colonial Zimbabwe, A History of the Ndanga Medical Unit, Fort Victoria, 1930s and 1960s. He is currently writing about epidemics of mental health and the contemporary history of codeine addiction in Africa. So today's format is that each will present their insights for 10 to 15 minutes and then open us all to questions. Thank you for joining us, and I do hope you enjoy the lectures. Over to you, Professor.
And I think you're going to set the ball rolling.
Yes, over to you. Over to you, Prof. Oh, mine.
Good afternoon. Thanks to Catherine and her colleagues for inviting me to present at this very prestigious webinar, and thanks to you all for attending. It's much appreciated indeed. So in this presentation, I would like to do what any historically minded person would do, and that is, I want to place the unfolding COVID-19 pandemic in the long continuum of historical epidemiology, using the concept of pathogen as a hermeneutical device. While historical epidemiology emerged from concerns about the environmental determinants of disease that have been associated with place, the concept of pathogen widens the scope significantly, helping us to see global era pandemics such as COVID-19 not only in a longue durée, but also as part of our footprint and misfit with processes of change in the Anthropocene era. So framed this way, I would like to argue, it is possible to see COVID-19 as the latest in a series of nightmarish episodes of entanglements of harmful microbes, humanity, and historical globalization. So having just, paid that introduction, I just want to deal with the first truths, and then I go deeper into what I want to share with you this afternoon. So in his poem, The Second Coming, Irish poet William Butler Yeats memorably said, and I quote, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world," close quote. To my mind, there is no better way other than this timeless poetic formulation by Yeats of describing the COVID-19 crisis, which started sweeping across the entire world during the early months of the year 2020. 2019, the novel microbe has been unleashing havoc across the world. Infections have been, spreading with alarming speed. People are dying in rapidly increasing numbers within a significantly compressed time period in more than 150 countries simultaneously. And the only recent precedent for this is the Spanish influenza pandemic of, approximately 102 years ago, which set the record for the worst short-term demographic disaster in the history of many nations. Future historians will certainly look back on this period and judge it as one of the most significant in the annals of global public health, at least since the outbreak of it. Early indicators are indeed that COVID-19 may act as a historical demarcation of sorts, that is separating the before COVID, which I call the BC, and the after COVID epochs. Indeed, as the Indian thinker Arundhati Roy has illustrated in a very beautiful essay that was published recently by the Financial Times, and I quote Roy here, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is not different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next." And of course, already, the new normal is the dominant talk of town. So, but while we leave it to future historians, who are far removed from this event to grapple with both the proper histories and the legacies of this pandemic, we can begin to write the first drafts of that future history. And one possible way of doing so, as I've suggested in my introduction, is to place the pandemic within the broad historical canvas of our current anthropogenic era, which is the Anthropocene. The changing dynamics of human beings' interaction with the environment over space and time have increasingly come into sharp focus in different scholarly domains, as well as in politics, in media, and in public culture. Except for mainly, and I want to emphasize this, mainly Republican White House occupants, beginning with Bush Sr., who said he would counter the greenhouse effect with what he called the White House effect, through to Donald Trump, who has done the unthinkable of, by withdrawing the world's second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases from the Comprehensive Paris Agreement. There is consensus that humanity has become an active geological force, inexorably altering the pace and direction of planetary ecology towards what we normally are told is the tipping point. So 20th century fears of planetary obliteration by nuclear bomb have now been overtaken by fears of planetary collapse by some cataclysmic climate event. This eventuality is depicted in the film The Edge of Stupid, which is an audacious act of historical futurology. Set in the dystopian world of 2055, the film depicts a lone survivor of a climate apocalypse, watching archival footage from the first decade of the current millennium and wondering why climate change was not stopped when there was still an opportunity to do so. The warning signs are indeed many. The increase in average annual temperatures and the melting of the permafrost are two key examples. But related to climate apocalypse, Alan Weizmann's World Without Us thought experiment could be reality if an uncontrollably deadly virus, such as the one depicted in the prophetic 2011 thriller Contagion, were to descend upon us today. So if COVID-19 is a foretaste of the horrific things that may befall us if we continue with our business as usual attitude in this age of the Anthropocene, when cast against the complex canvas of historical epidemiology, the current pandemic should be seen as the latest in a series of nightmarish episodes of microbial entanglements of nature, humanity, and globalization. Since the rise of what historians call the global convergence, which was driven initially by modern era Eurasian imperial networks from the 13th century onwards, and then by the Industrial Revolution from the 19th century, the world has been experiencing microbial integration of alarming proportions. Exponential growths of human webs of interaction, such as the sprawling urban conurbations, global trade networks, as well as faster travel facilitated by steamships and then recently jet airliners, have produced a global common market of microbes, as Emmanuel Leroy Ladurie beautifully frames it. As humans and microbial organisms co-evolve in closely knit environments, epidemics and pandemics have erupted. The Anthropocene has indeed become a veritable health risk multiplier, and scholars have started paying serious attention to this dynamic. Borrowing from mid-20th century musings of ecology scholars such as Fritz Schwedtfeger, I prefer to call this planetary microbial integration the pathocene. By this, I mean the long historical drift of lethal microbial forces as part of the emergent Anthropocene. As the Australian scholar Anthony J. McMakiel has observed, the profile of population's health reflects the underlying ecological human-environment coupled relationships. So as it involves the entanglements of microbial and human ecologies over space and time, world microbial integration has been characterized by eruptions of pandemics such as plague, TB, malaria, smallpox, yellow fever, cholera, pandemic influenza, HIV and AIDS, and now the novel coronavirus epidemic, among others. And I'm sure my fellow co-presenter will shed more light on some of these pandemics. And in its quest for solutions, the public health enterprise has also become part of this entanglement. In short, the pathocene is about the history of plagues and peoples. But casting the COVID-19 through the pathocene framework does not only help us to place the current pandemic in its proper epidemiological longitude, but also helps us to politicize it in very productive ways. So what do I mean by this? So in a hard-hitting commentary published by the influential British medical journal Lancet, the editor, Richard Horton, reminds us that, open quote, this global calamity is a crisis concerning health. It is a crisis about life itself, close quote. So quite clearly, it's not a pathological condition requiring prevention and therapeutic treatment. Instead, it is to say that epidemiological events tend to morph into what one scholar calls disease constructs, so construct with a big C. In other words, rulers and experts determine on the basis of a mix of biomedical, epidemiological, political, economic, and cultural data and models, the official responses to disease outbreaks. These responses are often defined by a great deal of ecological and cultural politics. Now, let me just turn to an overview of the historical evolution of what I call the pathocene. Although it is a very dynamic and complex historical phenomenon, the pathocene has evolved in 4 broad phases of microbial integration over the long course of history. The first major transformation in the relationship between microbes and humans occurred when early agrarian-based settlements enabled sylvatic and zootic microbes to make contact with human beings, or the Homo sapiens. The domestication of crops and animals and the co-evolution and mutual encroachment between human beings and nature have irrevocably altered the world microbial environment, leading to periodic eruptions of volatile bacterial and viral infections. The list is quite long, and I cannot exhaust in this very timed webinar. However, one of the early examples is the haunting story of mice and men, and here I'm playing around that very famous book by Johnny Steinbeck, which has blighted the world through several bubonic plague pandemics over millennia. And so the SARS-CoV-2, which is the COVID-19 virus, seems to fit this pattern, as it is popularly believed to be originating from the wild animal market in Wuhan, in China. The second major phase is the evolution of the pathogen occurred when early Eurasian civilizations, such as the Greek and Roman empires, China and South Asia, came into military and commercial contact around 3,000 to 2,000 years ago. And in that process, they swapped their dominant microbial infections. And a great deal of work is being done, highlighting how the highways for early modern commerce, such as the famous Silk Road, were also highways for microbes, causing infections such as bubonic plague, anthrax, and many other pandemics. As is well known, the bubonic plague has indeed had many round robins around the world from the 14th to the 19th century. Then the third phase was inaugurated by European expansionism over the past 5 centuries, which caused the transoceanic spread of very lethal infections. And the darkest strand of this transitional stage was when the process or the occurrence now called the Columbian Exchange occurred. So when the old world, Europe, transported previously unknown diseases to the new world, causing very massive infections and near population collapse in the new world. It was during this phase that the highly infectious waterborne diseases like cholera found its way from its place of origin in the Indian subcontinent and traveled along imperial networks to many parts of the world, including Europe, where it became a subject of a series of international conferences and health protocols during the mid-19th century. This phase also witnessed the travel of various influenza pandemics from such places as Hong Kong to different parts of the world, culminating in the outbreak of what is now commonly known as the mother of all pandemics, that is the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919. The fourth and last phase of the evolution of the pathogen, in my view, is the contemporary period that we're living in, a period defined by the outbreaks of novel infectious diseases such as SARS, MERS, HIV and AIDS, Ebola, Zika virus, COVID-19, but also the resurgence of old infections, some of them as a result of the superbacterial phenomenon, and the complex evolution of clinical biomedicine, which has, via blood transfusion, organ transplantation, and the use of the hypodermic syringe, created new opportunities for microbes to spread across the world. In this phase, global warming is enabling the re-emergence of previously controlled epidemics, especially where vector parasites are involved. It is also a phase defined by global modernity and standardized cultures, which are fostering the smothering of lifestyle diseases such as diabetes, obesity, hypertension, and the different types of cancers, among other things. The worldwide increase in the production and usage of agrochemicals is also creating new sets of challenges on the health front, with huge costs already being anticipated by our experts. So just to conclude, I would like to refer to a very beautiful essay that uses the 17th century world of plague as a sort of like a distant mirror that you know, for COVID-19. And this is an essay by Lorraine Duston. And you know, I'd like to quote Lorraine extensively here because I think, you know, her work goes to the heart of what, you know, is happening and how we can place COVID-19 in, you know, very long historical perspective. So Duston says, and I quote here, "We are living in a moment of ground zero empiricism in which almost everything is up for grabs, just as it was for the members of the earlier scientific societies and everyone else, you know, around 1660. But of course, Duston perceptively continues to say, of course, I exaggerate the analogy between then and now, thanks in no small part to the ingenuity, sagacity, and sheer persistence of thousands and thousands of researchers since the 17th century. We are the heirs not only to knowledge, you know, knowledge about what a virus is, what it does, and how, you know, to thwart it, but also to a diverse repertoire of ways of knowing, from well-designed experiments and systematic observations to chemical assays and statistical analysis to computer simulations. But I would like, as my final word, to say that to widen this very useful lens of viewing and understanding COVID-19, I would like to add the pathogen could be that one other productive way or avenue to place it in, you know, its long historical context. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was Dr. Glen Ncube of the University of Pretoria. Thank you so much for laying the groundwork by giving us a broad historical and conceptual framing of the pandemic. And over to you, Professor Phillips, as you bring it closer to home.
Thank you, Sinethemba, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this webinar. Flowing directly from the broad picture which Glen has sketched for you, it will come as no surprise to know that sub-Saharan Africa, indeed Africa as a continent, is no stranger to pandemics. There is a very long history, a very sorry history of pandemics striking the continent and particularly the subcontinent. What I want to say, I want to focus on pandemics which have struck Southern Africa and really see if one can stand back from the experience of these pandemics and try and identify some broader patterns, some broader trends which manifest themselves in pandemics generally. And this is not peculiar to sub-Saharan Africa or the world. There are patterns which seem to me to repeat themselves time and time again in the human response to pandemics. And this is no surprise because humans are humans, whether they are 5th century Europeans or 20th century Latin Americans, and all of us, and we are very aware of it now, have a life and death fear of epidemics. Epidemics raise fundamental issues about life and death and raise that fear. And the response of the human species has been very, very common, and one can track this in all societies at all times. Looking at Southern African history, there are perhaps 5 major pandemics, and then COVID would be the 6th, which have manifested themselves. Very briefly, 18th, 19th century, smallpox, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, bubonic plague. Thirdly, Glen has already mentioned the devastating Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, 1919. Fourthly, the polio pandemic of the 1940s and 1950s. And fifthly, HIV/AIDS since the 1980s. And COVID-19 would make the 6th of the pandemics which have struck the subcontinent. Now, if I stand back from these 5 pandemics, there are a couple of patterns which show themselves up to me. Perhaps 4 or 5 patterns, and I want to flag them so that you perhaps see these overarching trends which repeat themselves from one pandemic to the next. To a greater or lesser extent, they are not exactly the same, but all of them are apparent in some way. The first is the small part, is that what pandemics do is that they reveal the underpinning of society. They show up aspects of society which are there, but which perhaps are not noticed. They almost become common part and parcel of the landscape. And indeed, just to give you a sense of the way in which contemporaries recognized that pandemics show up society, the underpinnings of society, here's a quote from the 3rd century AD bishop of Carthage, St. Cyprian. St. Cyprian was caught up in a huge plague in the 250s, 260s. And he contemplated this and wrote a treatise called On Mortality. And he said, pestilence and plague search out the righteousness of each and every one and examines the minds of the human race. So here is someone at the other end of the continent in the midst of a plague, being very aware of the way in which epidemics and pandemics show up, demonstrate, reveal the underpinnings, almost the modus operandi of every society. I heard what I thought was a very appropriate description of this for the 20th century or 21st century. Someone wrote, pandemics are like X-rays. They show what's going on under the surface and bring to light. So that's the first thing that pandemics do. They reveal. The second thing that pandemics do, and in a sense, this might almost be a subset of the first, is that they produce finger pointing. Who's to blame? Who's responsible? This again is a standard human response in all societies at all times, because we are trying to figure out a way to control this threat to our lives. We want to know, where's it coming from? And so finger pointing, stigmatization is another very characteristic response of human society to pandemics and epidemics. The third response that I see in Southern Africa's experience with an encounter with pandemics, and indeed in pandemics generally, is that they tend to escalate existing trends which perhaps are there and moving slowly, are suddenly speeded up and accelerated by the intensity, by the fear which pandemics bring to societies. And so it's not a surprise that things which, with hindsight, we can see were underway, were slowly moving in train, suddenly, by the experience of the encounter with a pandemic, are transformed into a whole new feature of a society, which perhaps would not have easily been anticipated unless one was looking back and seeing it coming. The fourth dimension of responses to pandemics, which are so very much characteristic of human encounters, is that pandemics, serious epidemics, initiate completely new dimensions as well. Things which could not have been easily anticipated, things which perhaps were almost, you would say, from left field. They suddenly appear because of the nature of the epidemic. So they also initiate new things coming into a society suddenly, dramatically, frighteningly. And finally, in trying to identify patterns and trends which we can see from the experience of pandemics in Southern Africa and again worldwide, is that inevitably they trigger zeal for reform. Certainly for health reforms, that's a very obvious one, but by no means only health reforms. as Glen quoted from Arundhati Roy, the idea is that they are often portals for new reforms, new developments, social, economic, health, etc. And so those 5 dimensions, those 5 responses to pandemics, I can see in the major pandemics which have struck South Africa. And I would suggest, and my argument is very simply, that these patterns have and continue to repeat themselves in COVID-19. If you are aware of them, as I've tried to do by flagging them, then you will see these patterns, these responses, these consequences in COVID-19. Very briefly now, what I want to do is visit just each one of those 5 pandemics which I have referred to and point out at least one of these features of the human response which was manifested very dramatically in this particular epidemic. Let's see if the share screen function will work. The first pandemic, smallpox. Smallpox hit Southern Africa in 6 or 7 waves in the 18th and 19th century, the first of those being in 1713. And smallpox completely decimated the indigenous Khoikhoi population. Here you can see a contemporary painting, a contemporary sketch of a Khoikhoi funeral. And in the course of the smallpox epidemics, repeatedly coming back time after time, it absolutely devastated the Khoi population, reducing their numbers in a way completely without anticipation. So here you can see an example of how a pandemic, unanticipated, coming literally out of the blue, can significantly transform the population of a region. From having been a very significant pastoralist society, Khoikhoi population by each of these waves of smallpox, 1713, 1755, 1767, 1802, 1812, right through to the end of the 19th century, were reduced in numbers, a demographic disaster of the sort which Glen referred to in Latin America with the appearance of new diseases like smallpox there. The same happened here. Importantly also to remember about smallpox is that not only did it kill, but also we think that smallpox, if you survived it, left you infertile. So the capacity to reproduce a new generation was significantly compromised. And consequently, the Khoikhoi population, which before the appearance of the European settlers had been dominant, particularly in the southwestern Cape, was reduced to farm laborers, the remnants, the fragments of once a large pastoral society. So here's an example of smallpox coming as a disease unanticipated, without any prior warning, as it were, and significantly and fundamentally and for all times transforming the demographic situation in the subcontinent. So there's one example of how a pandemic can initiate something completely new. The second example I want to refer to comes from the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. When particularly the Cape was hit by bubonic plague, part of a massive worldwide pandemic starting originally in the 1870s in China. In Cape Town, it immediately produced an acceleration of a trend which had been in train, but not actually carried out. And also in this, you will see stigmatization, because the most obvious victims of bubonic plague were those people working in the docks who were Black Africans. working as stevedores. Immediately, the response of the colonial authorities was to say, who's to blame? And the finger was pointed characteristically at an out-group, a minority who were not part of the dominant elite of the dominant classes of Cape Town. And consequently, the colonial authorities were able to do something which they had talked about for 10 or 15 years as the African population began to grow of Cape Town, but had not been able to implement, and that was to segregate them. And this is a contemporary sketch of Black Africans. You can see them between the soldiers here, being marched out of District 6 to a new location on the Cape Flats at Ndabeni. So here's an example of a pandemic providing an opportunity to do something which had been talked about but not yet executed. So here you can see it as an escalation, as an acceleration, taking something which was there but had not yet the force to actually be implemented. So this is the beginning of urban segregation in Southern Africa, particularly of Black Africans. Ever more dramatic is what happened when bubonic plague also shifted to Johannesburg. In Johannesburg, it particularly hit an area which in 1904 was known as Coolie location, which had a very mixed and heterogeneous population of African, Indian, and colored. This too had been something which the town authorities had been champing at the bit to try and eliminate and move. And what they did was to take this outbreak of bubonic plague and to forcibly remove the population of Coolie location, and as this next slide shows, literally razed to the ground. They burnt Coolie location. That's a very dramatic contemporary photograph of Coolie location being burnt to the ground. The inhabitants were moved to a sewage farm 12 miles west of Johannesburg at a place called Klipspruit. And after the plague had ebbed, Indians and coloreds were allowed to filter back into Johannesburg. But Africans were told, this Klipspruit is where you will stay in future. And to give a very long projection, Klipspruit became in the 1930s Pimville, where Africans were forced to live, and Pimville became the heart of Soweto. So Soweto is where it is now because of a forced eviction of the population of Coolie location back in 1904, 1905. So here's an example of a pandemic intensifying something which had been talked about and turning it into harsh reality. The next example is of the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu showed up, and here's an example of the way in which a pandemic can reveal dramatically what had been there but had not been acted upon. The Spanish flu showed up dramatically, poor housing in the slums of Cape Town, where whites were regarded as living in unhealthy, insalubrious, insanitary conditions. And as a consequence, because of the revelation of the Spanish flu, a new housing initiative was begun. With private funds and with government funds, a garden city was laid out. And here's the tablet commemorating the establishment of Pinelands as the first garden city. So here's an example of how a revelation by a pandemic can produce action which had not previously been possible. Indeed, another consequence of the Spanish flu was to prompt central government into passing the first Housing Act in 1920 to provide state funds for housing. So there's a fundamental shift in South Africa where the state commits itself to provide funding. That is another example of how a pandemic can trigger reforms which previously had not really been carried out or likely to be implemented. If we move to the polio epidemic of the 1940s and 1950s, this is a strange epidemic. And what it did is very clearly, amongst other things, is to show up who really had clout in South African society, in early apartheid South African society, when polio epidemic broke out, because it affected overwhelmingly young whites, the future generation of those in power. No expense was spared to provide some kind of ways of countering the effects of polio. This is Durban's Addington Hospital with a whole series of iron lungs, which was the state-of-the-art way to deal with polio in the 1940s and 1950s, until a polio vaccine was developed in the mid-1950s, which removed iron lungs as the way. But you can see dramatically the way in which, because of the political power, because of the voice of the white population in early apartheid South Africa, the response of the state was huge, dramatic. Glen referred to how pandemics can be constructed. In effect, the polio pandemic was relatively light in the numbers which it affected. But because overwhelmingly those who were affected were the future white generation, the response of the state was overwhelming and dramatic. And this is what this slide shows. And finally, to revert to something else which I've already referred to that pandemics do, and that is stigmatization. HIV/AIDS is a classic example of how fingers were pointed to identify those who were to blame. And it doesn't go it's not very far from blame to action, as this poignant, tragic slide shows. Gugu Dlamini, an activist, was beaten to death near KwaMashu outside Durban after publicly disclosing her HIV positive status. In December, Gugu went on national TV and disclosed her HIV positive status in 1998. A few days later, a group of men from the community beat her to an inch of her life. They then pushed her down a cliff and told a neighbor, "Go and tell them to come and fetch their dog. We are done with it." The daughter had to fetch her mother's unrecognizable swollen body. The neighbors wouldn't assist because they believed their cars would be infected and in turn infect them. Gugu died from her injuries. Here you can see very dramatically the tragedy of stigmatization when finger pointing turns into beating with one's fists and worse. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much to Professor Phillips and to Dr. Ncube. So we'll have a little bit of time for questions. I already have some here. What I'll do is I won't do justice to how the questions have been worded, but I'll just try summarize. I'll ask 3 at a time and give it over to the panelists to respond. So maybe we can start with a question from Jennifer. Could Glen and Howard comment on the flourishing of counterfactuals and the use of history during pandemics? How is history being used? History as a field is being debated itself. And then there's a question from Dennis Webster. Fascinating how pandemics were used to make and remake cities. To both panelists, do you see any similarities in our own pandemic? Will we remember COVID as something that intervened physically in the landscape in the same way? And then there's 2 questions, but I think I'll try summarize them into one. One is from Julie Paul to Dr. Ncube. Can you speak a little more about the industrial and global scale of animal farming and its links to infectious diseases? Also, can we still hold on to the notion of an Anthropocene when it seems clear that it has been a brief period in the long durée of Pathocene? And then I think related to that question is a question from Sandra Swart. I'm interested in the word Pathocene. Do you think the Pathocene basically now, with accelerated intrusion into new habitats, wet markets plus global industrial, or is it 10,000 years old? So it speaks about the timing again of the Pathocene. May we start with Professor Phillips?
The first question was about history being used. I mean, one of the things which strikes me very markedly indeed during the COVID ongoing crisis is how unaware people are that there is a very long history of epidemics and pandemics in South Africa and elsewhere. And consequently, it has been very widespread to toss around. It is without precedent. We've never seen this before. It is not something that we know of. And it really does, to me, I find it quite depressing that so little is known about previous pandemics. And as I've tried to indicate in the presentation which I've given, what we can learn from those previous pandemics. So to Jennifer, I would say that it seems to me that history is not being used very effectively and hasn't been used very effectively in the midst of COVID-19 to learn from previous pandemics. Not because COVID is an exact duplicate, of course it isn't, but those patterns, those responses, those human reactions are there time and time again. And if we know what to look for, then in the midst of COVID, we can say, aha, now that is a very common human response, whether it's stigmatization of people from China, or whether it is promises that we will definitely have major health reforms. All of these are very much echoing what previous pandemics have taught us. So I would say, Jennifer, that really we don't know enough about history and the history of pandemics. And one of my very, very strong emphases is that pandemics and South Africa's interaction with pandemics needs to be made part and parcel of the general knowledge of our history in schools and in universities. Glen, you want to run with that and take up something else on history?
Well, I think you've eloquently and adequately responded to that. So I'll try and confine myself to questions on the Pathocene, which I'll see have been asked by Julie and Sandra. And if I skipped anyone else, my apologies. But I think to address Julie's question first, I think you are right. The global animal farming on an industrial scale, the consumption of meat, could it be of domesticated animals, or in this case, in the case of COVID-19, of wild animals. I think this has been one of the surest ways of increasing infectious diseases, which is why when I gave an overview of the development of the Pathocene, my first stage was referring to the transfer of what were previously wild diseases to human beings, and that from the wild to the human has continued over time. And I think COVID-19 is, if what we are told, that it emerged out of the wet market in China is correct, then it proves this hypothesis that indeed the consumption of animal products, which has resulted in their farming at industrial scale. It could be chicken farming, which often I think we have had issues when it comes to chicken farming, avian influenza, etc., etc. So this I think you correct. The farming of animals at industrial scale promotes these diseases. Now, with regards to whether we should, give up the notion of the Anthropocene for the Pathocene, well, I would say in the specific case of diseases or microbial integration, I would really say that, the Pathocene works well for me because, it predates what we now call the Anthropocene. So in the long scheme of things, what we call the Anthropocene now would be a particular phase in the development of the Pathocene. And I really say this very specifically in the case of pandemics and epidemics. I guess the notion of the Anthropocene could still apply very well in other areas. Then on to Sandra Swartz's question. Yes, indeed, I think you're correct, Sandra, that the notion of the Pathocene was first used by ecologists, in the 40s, but particularly the earliest reference which I got was the 1950s, and then there were attempts by archaeologists to also pick up on that. But I employed specifically here to think about this wider issue of world microbial integration, which evolved in stages, by the way. So I wouldn't, confine the Pathocene to now. But as I, indicated in the presentation, it seems to me, tentatively, that it evolved in stages, and I've identified 4 so far. Stages that, really show that there've been certain trends as far as microbial integration is concerned, through imperial expansion, through trade networks, through travel and better travel, through many other means. So it's been developing in stages. So I would say the Pathocene really covers a very long period rather than the now. Thank you.
Sine, can I respond to Dennis Webster's question about the impact of epidemics on cities? One of the aspects which I've noticed, and this is obviously very much a Cape Town episode. Last year, a fair number of refugees from elsewhere in Africa sought to occupy the United Nations Refugees Office in Cape Town, demanding that they should be allowed to move because they were unhappy in South Africa and were subject to xenophobia. They were eventually removed from the office, and a nearby church in central Cape Town allowed them to move into the church, and there they remained, and the numbers grew and grew and grew. And it was very clear in the second half of 2019 that the municipal authorities were hard put to know quite how to handle this delicate issue. They wanted to remove them, they wished to remove them, but the human rights dimensions prevented them. Along comes COVID-19, and in double quick time, March 2020, they were forcibly removed from the church and dispersed, I don't know where. So there's an example of how something which authorities had wanted to do with regard to who lived where or who resided where in Cape Town, but were unable to act. COVID-19 gave them in double quick time the opportunity to act, because this is now a health issue, and to remove. And I think that this is something which COVID-19 will show up, reveal very, very clearly indeed, the accelerating pace of urbanization and the consequences which flow. It would be telling to have a photograph of an air photograph of a city of South Africa, a city in South Africa in February 2020, and that same vantage point in December 2020. My guess is that the number of informal settlements will have increased hand over fist.
Thank you so much, Professor Phillips and Dr. Ncube. So because of time, what I'm going to do is, again, I'll try summarize the last questions. There are some comments and thanks from various audience members. We will carry on engaging even though the session is closed. But for now, can I just kind of summarize this chunk of questions for our panelists to respond and perhaps include your closing remarks. So we have Mihleli, Linda, and Sipho are interested in this, the same thing in terms of systemic racism and pandemics. With Mhleli saying, I'm getting the distinct impression that a pandemic provides the opportunity for racism as witnessed in the movement of Africans out of District 6, moving Africans into Soweto, and much recently, the ill treatment of Africans in China. Is my thinking correct? If so, which part of history reflects a different attitude or approach? We have a question here from Sharon Fon. There is much hope of a more equal, more progressive post-COVID world. Are there any examples of such outcomes in history, from history? We have a question from Alex Chandler. I wonder if the panel could discuss the language that has historically been used to create the blame narrative. I'm thinking specifically of HIV and AIDS being referred to as the gay plague, etc. Is there a precedent for this with a specific focus on language? We have a question from Janet Giddy. One of the differences between COVID and the other epidemics described is that thanks to modern science, we can now diagnose people who are infected but asymptomatic. This hugely boosts the numbers of those infected, which adds to the anxiety as the increasing numbers are constantly highlighted. The word case-demic has been used by some to describe this. In previous pandemics where diagnostic lab tests were generally not available, only the numbers of those sick could be counted. Do you think this has added significantly to how this pandemic is being described as unprecedented? And then I think I'll take this question from Dr. Thulane Kwabe. Were there any African indigenous interventions that were trialed out back during those pandemics? If there was none, why was that so? Isn't it time now we look deeply into indigenous interventions by engaging our indigenous healers, even on academic levels? It's also about time indigenous knowledge systems is included into South Africa's School of Health. Maybe I will leave it to those and then we'll carry on if there's more time.
Glen, sorry, can I have a quick response and then over to you? Okay. I think the question about systemic racism and how epidemics show this up, it is because what epidemics do, in a sense, they don't create abnormal situations. What they do is that they highlight the abnormalities in a society and in a situation. And the racism is there. What epidemics do is provide the opportunity for that racism to be expressed. And as we've seen in the case of the creation of Dabeni and of Klipspruit, and to be acted upon. So I think, once again, what I'm arguing is that epidemics and pandemics show up the underpinnings, the often very ugly underpinnings of a society, and allow action to be taken in the name of public health. In terms of the language of stigmatization, I argue very much along the same lines, that the veneer of polite behavior, the veneer of easy social interaction is thrust aside by pandemics because people are frightened, people are scared about their lives. And that means that they don't hesitate to express their prejudice, their attitudes to others. Glen, you carry on with perhaps some of the other questions.
Thank you. I'll briefly respond to Janet Gilly's question about the numbers game. Well, I'm quite aware that the word unprecedented has been used quite often, but when it comes to numbers, COVID-19 is nowhere near, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. In terms of, available statistics alone, I think, the deaths in Africa from the Spanish flu were more than 300,000, right? So, COVID-19, we really haven't gotten there yet. And then globally, I mean, it was millions, I think more than, Howard is the expert on this. Maybe he can correct me there, but it's record that maybe 25 to 50 million people were, affected. So the word unprecedented is used because, people are panicking and it's really frightening, but we are nowhere near some of the, pandemics that, wrecked the world in history. Even bubonic plague, I mean, which decimated a very, very large European population. So COVID-19 really has not, gotten there yet. And then there was a question about, the hope that the post-COVID world would be a progressive one, and whether there are any lessons from history, whether there are any examples from history. I think, Professor Phillips has eloquently and very well summarized some of the lessons that we've learned from history. What I can only add is that the legacies of pandemics tend to be very complex and very indeterminate. So I would say, these remain only hopes. Certainly, we do see some positive legacies. For example, soon after the Spanish, influenza in Africa, there were attempts to strengthen, health systems in particular ways, and certainly as a result of, the different, epidemics and pandemics that were sweeping across the world, we begin to see in the perhaps from early 20th century to the mid 20th century, innovations in medicine, better patient management, and many, many other innovations, including, of course, the invention of treatments and vaccines, etc., etc. But I don't know whether that is what we could call the post-pandemic, progressive world or not, because we also do see, some of the examples that Professor Phillips was talking about, whereby you begin to see some very not so good, processes and occurrences in society being accelerated, and many of those tend to be negative. So, without, ending on a pessimistic note, I wouldn't put lots of my hope on the post-COVID world as a progressive world. There's still lots that, needs to be done, and it remains to be seen what the post-COVID world would be like. Thank you so much.
Sadly, it's time for us to wrap up. I suppose time is never on our side with such interesting discussions. Thank you so much, Professor Phillips. Thank you so much, Dr. Ncube. We couldn't get to all the questions, especially the one about traditional medicine. Please do look into Professor Phillips' last book. There's a big section on traditional medicine. And people can find the recordings of the webinars on the website. The website address is on the closing slide. But please do remember to join us next week when we speak about pandemic pangolins, systems, science and society, pandemic innovations. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your days. Togos.